Running for elected office requires certain skills. Governing requires others. In our country's early years, aspiring politicians might tailor their speeches to the audience according to their respective strengths. Beginning in the 20th century and continuing in the 21st, as methods of communication evolved from radio, TV, internet, and now podcasting, and yes, influencers, the rules have changed. I'm Jim Falk, and welcome to our program where we continue a conversation about the presidency and presidential leadership. We will also discuss how the demands of the highest office have changed and whether we expect too much from our elected leaders. To explore these questions and more, let me bring in two nationally recognized experts on the presidency and the art of governing. Coming to us from Washington, D.C. is John Lawrence. For 38 years, Dr. Lawrence was a senior congressional staff member, serving from 2005 to 2013 as Chief of Staff to Nancy Pelosi. He is now a visiting professor at the University of California's Washington Center, where he teaches about Congress and contemporary American politics, and is the author of a really interesting book, Arc of Power, Inside Nancy Pelosi's Speakership, which is now available in paperback. Jeremi Suri is a frequent guest of the program. He's a presidential historian at the University of Texas at Austin, where he is the Distinguished Professor for Global Leadership, History, and Public Policy. Is the author of a number of books, but one that is of particular interest for our conversation today is The Impossible Presidency, The Rise and Fall of America's Highest Office. Great to have both of you with us. So one of the things that I think is so interesting now is how audiences have changed. And both of you are just natural to talk about this. I mean, Abraham Lincoln had certain talents, but I don't think he was telegenic. You're certainly seeing FDR with the radio, Kennedy with the television, Obama, social media, and now influencers. I mean, when you think about how Donald Trump reached over 50 million people with a 3-hour podcast. It's really remarkable how there's this evolution. Jeremy, could I get your thoughts on this?
Sure. I think it's a radical shift from where the presidency was the first half of our history, right? We have to remember that until Theodore Roosevelt, no candidate really campaigned publicly for president. What you were supposed to do is sit on your front porch and have your minions, your campaign advisors, and others out there for you. You were not supposed to say negative things. Surrogates, right? You were not supposed to say negative things about your opponent. You were supposed to show a degree of decorum, statesmanlike behavior. Theodore Roosevelt's really the first candidate to go out on the hustings and to use the railroad car, which of course then Truman makes famous with his whistle-stop campaign in 1948, right? Going around the country, giving hell to the audience and really making yourself a personality in their lives. What happens in the end of the 20th century is this story now goes virtual. And people really become interested not so much in what presidents have to say, but in the emotional content that they're able to evoke in their audience. And that's a lot of what we see. Do I feel this candidate feels me? Do I feel a connection to this candidate? And the world of influencing and the world of podcast is very much about that. There's a serious substance to it. I'm not denying that. But it's very much about emotional contacts, interpersonal relations between this virtual president that you see or hear and your life. And can you see that person connecting to your life?
John, what do you think about this?
That's exactly right. 100 years ago, there was something called the Chautauqua Circuit, and people would go and listen to people give speeches that went on for 2 and 3 hours. It was a major source of entertainment, and part of your success as a politician, let alone as a presidential candidate, it would have to do with your ability to hold the audience for that period of time. We all know in the messaging business now, you don't have 2 or 3 hours. You're lucky if you have 2 or 3 minutes. And so what that does is, in a combination with very highly separated parties and very ideological points of view, is it gives all of the momentum and all of the advantage to those people who can succinctly summarize how they are reaching out to and speaking for portions of the public. Nobody wants to hear the details of somebody's financial plan for the country. What they want to hear is, are you empathetic? Do you get what my problem is? I think, during this last campaign, it's almost become a trope now that the most successful argument was having to do with the price of eggs. It didn't matter what the Federal Reserve was going to do or what the Federal Trade Commission was going to do about trade policy or tariffs or whatever it was. Do you understand how expensive it is for me? And if you can master that in conjunction with the technology, which is short, pithy, targeted, that's successful messaging and outreach by any contemporary politician. President Trump knows how to talk in the succinct, sharp, telegenic kind of style because that's the world he lived in. He was a reality television performer. And I don't think it's any mistake, incidentally, or any coincidence that many of the people he's chosen for his cabinet come out of telecommunications. They're not there because of their great policy expertise. They're there to sell the policy that is determined by policymakers in the White House or deeper within these departments that will generate public opinion by connecting those policies to public attitudes.
I think it's Pew just came out with a report that showed young adults, something like 37%, get their news from influencers. And, I certainly don't know what the answer is, but this is not really the best way for people to learn about the news or the history of our country and our institutions. What does this mean for the future, Jeremi?
Well, I mean, I do think we've always had influencers, right? When I was growing up, it was the tail end of Johnny Carson's career. But Johnny Carson was an influencer, right? Walter Cronkite, to some extent, was an influencer, right? Those who we identify as traditional news media or traditional television, late night shows, whatever, these were people who had an enormous amount of influence. We believed they had certain qualifications to understand the political issues they were talking about. But we also know that they were bounded by certain assumptions. One of the problems during the Vietnam era was that the assumptions of the influencers didn't match the reality on the ground during the Vietnam War. And so I'm not sure it's a bad thing to have influencers. I think the question is who those influencers are and how qualified they are to actually comment on what they're commenting on. And I think we need to do a better job of that. Just because someone is pithy and eloquent in this short TikTok space or whatever it is, that doesn't mean they're necessarily qualified to advise you on the war in Ukraine. We should be looking for influencers, but the right influencers.
And it's also how you reach millions of people, because I was really surprised just to read recently how small the audience is for MSNBC or even CNN. Fox has a large audience, but it pales in comparison to the networks, which are now network news, which tend to have a lot of human interest pieces, but not the hard news that you had with Walter Cronkite.
I agree with that, and I think in retrospect it was a mistake. I don't think it would have changed things necessarily, but it was a mistake for candidate Harris not to appear on the Joe Rogan podcast. I mean, this is a podcast that reaches millions and millions, especially of American men, more so than most newscasts, more so than 60 Minutes. And that's an audience that, for better or worse, one has to talk to, and one has to work through the communications channels that get you to them. We can like or dislike Joe Rogan, but nonetheless, he's a communication channel to a large number of voters. And as a candidate today, you have to play that game. That's part of what democratic politics is about.
Go ahead, John.
One of the issues here, Jim, is also that we have such an explosion now in terms of the sources of information. When you and I, maybe not Jeremi, but when you and I were younger, you had basically 3 networks, and there was a filtering process. You didn't get to be on the CBS or NBC Evening News saying anything that came out of the top of your head. And there was an FCC doctrine called the equal time provision, where you would not, as a licensee, be able to take overtly ideological positions to get a federal license. We don't have that doctrine anymore. Most of the podcasts and social media don't even come under the control of the FCC. And nobody is commanding 60, 70 million people a night the way Walter Cronkite did. I think it's really important, maybe one of the most important on this historically in this entire subject, is that when Walter Cronkite went to Vietnam and came back and made a broadcast that this policy is a disaster, it is not going to be successful, Lyndon Johnson's reaction to that would say, if I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost the country. I don't know that there's anybody in today's media who commands that kind of breadth on the one hand and credibility on the other hand. And it's this fragmentation and this ideological fragmentation where everybody is not listening to the same facts or the same presentation that makes it so hard to develop consensus.
I want to take advantage of the fact that we have a historian on the House and a historian on the presidency to talk about checks and balances, because it seems to me that in recent history, and certainly since 9/11, that the executive certainly has precedence and that the House has, to a degree, relinquished its responsibility. Is that a fair statement? John, I'll let you go first on this.
Well, I think that since the Depression, there has been a general movement of political power to the executive branch. And I think in the mid-'70s, I wrote about in my first book on the class of '74, there were efforts on the part of Congress to claw that back with the institution of things like expanded congressional oversight. The nature of international, even national crises is such that as we've moved to more crises, whether it's nuclear crisis, environmental catastrophes, financial crises, they require the kind of swift action that really only an executive typically can provide. But I would not say that Congress, and this will be something to really watch carefully in the beginning of the Trump administration, Congress has got to, as an institution, be careful not to yield too much of its power. We're going to see a good example here where President Trump, for example, is proposing that the Senate step away from its advise and consent role, a constitutional responsibility for high-level appointments, and simply allow him to put people into cabinet level appointments and other high level appointments without their review, or with a very perfunctory review. It will be interesting to see if the Senate, particularly since there's a new Senate majority and a new Senate majority leader, acquiesces in that kind of abdication of constitutional responsibility in the face of a popularly elected president, or whether or not they continue to assert their historical and constitutional authority to serve as part of the checks and balances system.
But on issues like the authorization to use military force, it seems to me that many members of the House or the Senate, they just don't want to stick their neck out and say where they stand. And so the executive branch has pretty much free rein. Jeremi?
Well, I think on issues of war and peace, yes. I mean, I think if there's an imperial presidency, the phrase used by Arthur Schlesinger a generation ago, it's certainly in the foreign policy space. The founders never intended for presidents to be able to send forces around the world and only just tell Congress afterwards. And Congress tried under the War Powers Act, which Professor Lawrence has written about, tried actually to limit this, but it did not work, right? Presidents are able to deploy force. President Biden is able to make decisions about the use of American missiles and rockets that are hitting Russia without consulting Congress. It's only when he wants to tell Congress that he tells them. So that is absolutely a case, and that's a reality of the international system and a reality of the United States operating so broadly around the world in the way it does. At home, though, I think there are many more checks on presidential power. And one of the reasons I wrote about the presidency being impossible is that I think the public expects presidents to be able to deliver all sorts of public programs and public legislative benefits. And it's very hard, even when you have your own party in control of Congress, because members of Congress have their own agendas, and on domestic issues, they have an enormous amount of power. And no one exemplified this more than the person that John Lawrence worked for, Nancy Pelosi, who used her position as Speaker of the House, I would say, to be as influential in shaping domestic politics as any figure in the last 30 to 40 years. I'll just commend Professor Lawrence's book, which shows how important Nancy Pelosi was to the definition and the provisions of the Affordable Care Act. It's as much her bill as it was Barack Obama's, it seems to me, and that shows the power of Congress, particularly for domestic issues.
But presidents who want to have success legislatively, they have been the ones who have understood the importance of working with Congress, and yet several presidents haven't, and I guess some that have been people who have not been brought up, raised within the Beltway, or how had those positions. And so I think, say, Jimmy Carter, for instance, or even President Obama, they would have been much more effective, wouldn't they have, John, if they had worked closer with Congress?
Well, certainly in the case of Jimmy Carter, and with historically with other presidents, I think Jeremy would agree. People who come in who don't have federal experience are at a real disadvantage. Part of that is not understanding the dynamics of Congress, that Congress does not buy into the imperial presidency notion quite as readily as people who work on the other side of Pennsylvania Avenue. But part of it also is that presidents who have not had long Washington experience, don't have the personal relationships with people in government. And whatever party you are, whatever ideology you are, politics is intensely a personal business. And you can have virulent disagreements with people on policy questions, but you try to maintain an open channel. George W. Bush did a great job on this throughout his administration, and it paid off when we needed to suddenly work very collaboratively in the economic crisis of September of 2008. George H.W. Bush, who had served one term as president in the House of Representatives, understood the importance of maintaining those personal relationships and came up to play handball in the gym in the Rayburn building as vice president and as president, sitting around and talking to people who he had strong disagreements with. Ronald Reagan would have people over for dinner and sit down and talk to them and then try to figure it out what they could do. Whereas Barack Obama was constantly being criticized, Jimmy Carter constantly being criticized for not stroking Congress, for not being as gracious, not having people down to watch football and eat popcorn together, the kind of massaging that either in terms of a specific piece of legislation or just in terms of building that level of trust is so crucial to a successful presidency.
And going back 200 years or so, Thomas Jefferson was famous for having people over for wine and dinner, and that's made him much more effective. I wonder if we're in a position now where, and this gets back to this recent election, that it was so close. Are we in a position where it's always going to be down to the line for a few swing states?
I don't think so. No, I think we're in a moment when our country is pretty evenly divided. We've been in these moments before, and then there will be a breakthrough that will occur, and it can occur for good or for ill. It can occur because, as some have written about, right, a figure emerges, and that figure is able to galvanize people. A Democrat who can actually appeal to the working class, one who comes from a working class background, a little more someone of that. Or it can happen from an event that is so shattering to the country that it discredits someone. I don't want it to happen that way, but that might be the way it happens. The United States benefits so enormously from a set of institutions and rules that we developed, not in the Constitution, we developed in the last 50 to 70 years, right? The international banking system, the role of the dollar internationally, a free trade system, a set of liberal international rule orders. And I understand that some people are critical of these things, but if they go away, the harm to the United States, the disruption, is going to be quite significant. And that might very well transform a divided public into a public that all of a sudden has more of a consensus on certain issues. That's not the pleasant way to get there. It's what we might call the Great Depression or Civil War model. But that's what happened after each of those major disasters for the country.
Well, I can't believe it, but I'm still getting emails almost every day from No Labels. And as we remember, they were talking about putting in a third candidate. Do you think that is the idea of a third party still just out of the question? Or do you think, given where we are now, that you might see some people that are aiming to establish that? What do you think, John?
I'd be very surprised. I think a lot of the American system is structured against a third party historically. the nature of the presidency, unlike in a lot of parliamentary countries, the fact that we elect a president on a national basis, unlike most other countries, really strengthens the concept of a two-party system. It's very difficult to predict. I remember back in the Obama years that people were saying, there's a Democratic lock on the Electoral College. It may never be another Republican president. And then people were saying, well, there's always going to be a Democratic success because of the rising number of Black voters and Hispanic voters. And this time around, I said, well, we may not win this time, but we're sure going to win long term because all these young people are growing up very comfortable with multiculturalism, and so they're all going to be Democrats, except that the younger voters first-time voters happen to vote for Donald Trump. So it's very, very difficult to predict how this is going to go, and you can see that just in some states that have shifted. Our own state of New Mexico, which has become a pretty reliable state a generation ago, was a mixed state at best and very often Republican. Certainly look at a state like Arizona, a state where growth like North Carolina might change things significantly. So I think it's very hard to be predictive. We are a different country than we were in 72 or 84, where there were these electoral and popular vote blowouts. But the fact of the matter is, we're all better at looking backwards than we are in looking forwards, and we just don't know what the forces are going to be. I do agree with Jeremi, however. There's nothing like focusing attention like a crisis, and a good president and a good Congress know how to use a crisis.
I think we actually have had a third party, actually just in the last 4 years. That third party has taken over one of the two parties. Our system is structured, as Professor Lawrence said, around two parties because it's a winner-take-all system in the Electoral College. It's a winner-take-all system in local elections as well. You don't get anything for coming in second. So you've got to be one of two parties. But what has happened in the last 4 years now, maybe the last 8 years we want to say, is that Trump created his own party. He took over the Republican Party. When he was elected in 2016, it was a kind of merger of the two. But every indication to me now is that he is basically purging the Republican Party of Republicans and making it his party.
Oh, that's why I wonder if there's not room for
third party take over.
That's why I wonder if there's not room for another party, because it seems to me that there's a large group of the center that are looking for something else.
The question will be whether they stick with the Republican Party, and one test will be in the Senate, where many of them are actually still Republicans, not Trump people. They're not elected because of Trump. John Thune is not there because of Donald Trump. He wasn't Donald Trump's choice to be majority leader. Will he go along with what Trump wants, or will he stake out a different position? But ultimately, they will have to choose as to be whether to be one party or the other, because the system doesn't allow a third party to get much of anything, right? So you've got to take over one of the two parties. It's an oligopolist system, not a pluralist system in terms of parties.
Most successful third parties, and I guess, Jeremi, maybe you would agree that Donald Trump fits into this model. The most successful third parties in American history have been built around individuals, and they have not been grassroots-based parties that end up, with the exception of the Republican Party in 1856 and then successfully in 1860. If you look at parties like the Bull Moose Party with Theodore Roosevelt, or the Progressive Party with Henry Wallace in 1948, or the States' Rights Party with Strom Thurmond, or George Wallace in 68, or Ross Perot in 92, these parties provided momentum from the power of an individual, and they did not build the infrastructure of party that outlasted that individual. What ends up happening is these major parties are clever enough or strategic enough to absorb them and to find ways to bring those dissident factions in and strengthen their own parties. In the case of Trump, I think Jeremy makes an incredibly interesting point here, and that is that it's the outside group that's actually absorbed the existing party, and where those dissident Republicans go will be really fascinating to watch. They didn't become liberals. They're now going to be the people who say the party left them, the same way Dixiecrats left the Democratic Party saying, hey, I didn't change, my party changed. So where do they go? Do they become Democrats the way Dixiecrats became Republicans? Do they splinter off? Do they drop out of politics? I don't know, but I think let's not overestimate. The Republican Party is Donald Trump's party at this point.
a lot for you both to write about in your blogs and on your podcast. Jeremi, we have just about 2 minutes left, so I'd like to give you a minute, if I'm sorry it's such a short period of time, to talk about the office of the presidency and why it's so difficult at this point in time.
As I've written, I think it's an impossible office because the president is expected to do three things, among many other things, that contradict each other. On the one hand, the president is supposed to be the great exponent of a system of freedom and liberty and individualism that encourages pluralism. But at the same time, he's supposed to be, and it's still a he, supposed to be a moral leader that sets out a moral vision. So everyone should be included, but yet this vision is supposed to be a morally tight, coherent vision. The president is expected to address every single international crisis, from Gaza to Ukraine to North Korea to the South China Sea. And then at home, as we just discussed, the president is responsible for the price of eggs. This is a set of expectations that are widely held across party lines, a set of expectations that are encouraged by candidates. And the office, therefore, is set up to do so many things that it can do nothing well. And what I try to show in the book is that presidents spend most of their time running from crisis to crisis, reacting to one event after another, not providing the strategic leadership that we later judge them on and later hope that our presidents can
I can say I wish I had some optimism that there would be some type of reform for the presidency, but I think it's highly unlikely, but we sure were lucky to have both of you talking about it today. Thanks so much. Really good to see both of you. It goes without saying that anyone elected to an office, whether as a member of city council, Congress, or even president of the United States, believes that they will have the ability, the power to effect change and to achieve their campaign promises. Quickly, however, I think often to their surprise, they realize that there are limits put in place as guardrails, checks and balances. So how they react to this is often a very good indication of how successful they will be. We hope that today's conversation has provided all of you with a wider lens through which to observe and consider the political process. Thank you for being a part of the program, Perspectives Matter, where we talk about things that matter with people who care.